Hi, I'm Art Mattson, Lynbrook Village Historian, and I'd like to welcome you to another few minutes of Lynbrook history. I'm standing at the Long Island Railroad train station in Lynbrook, and the Long Island Railroad was indeed the scene of a major crime in 1925, a mail train robbery. It was big news for Long Island, but even bigger news for Lynbrook when a week after the crime was committed, the news came out in the New Era newspaper of Lynbrook that James Watt Cadoo, the son of a wealthy home builder in Lynbrook and lumber merchant, had committed the crime. I want to tell you a bit about 1925 because that was an important year in Lynbrook's history. A lot of things were changing and a lot of things remained the same. For example, over on Broadway, we still had Smith Robbins, the blacksmith of the village, hitting his hammer on his anvil, making horseshoes. Ka-ting, ka-ting, ka-ting. You could hear that sound all around the village. Shorty the cop was still down at the Five Corners directing traffic and attracting crowds of people at lunchtime to watch him move his arms almost like an acrobat. But things were changing because in 1925, that year, Lynbrook was the fastest growing village in Nassau County. And as a sign of that growth and our arrival as an important village on the map, the village erected its municipal hall, Village Hall, just down Merrick Road on the other side of the Five Corners. Of course, that building has since been torn down and replaced by our modern Village Hall today. Another change came tragically when the St. James Church burned to the ground. That church with its tremendous spire could be seen all the way from the ocean by Long Beach when folks were being directed out towards Lynbrook from, say, Jamaica. They'd be told, you see that spire down Merrick Road? Well, just head that way, and when you come to Shorty the Cop, you'll know you're in Lynbrook. But the big news happened in January of that year, because on January 14th, people woke up to read their morning newspaper and see that a train robbery had taken place. Back in 1925, the Long Island Railroad was not elevated. That did not come until 1939 that the Lynbrook station was raised up. In 25, it ran all along the ground, and so in Lynbrook, there were crossings at grade level where traffic guards, crossing guards, would monitor the crossing stations. Each evening, a train would run from Babylon into Jamaica, and it would carry mail. Not only mail, but also bank deposits. The train left Belmore at 6:30 on the evening of January 13th. The mail clerk was inside the mail car. It was the last of an 8-car train with a baggage car in front of it. And inside that mail car, the clerk was busily sorting the mail. He had to be quick because he only had 4 minutes before he would get to the Merrick station. And he had to get the Merrick mail ready to put outside for the next mail clerk to pick up. As the train left that Belmore station, suddenly, to the great surprise of the mail clerk inside, someone appeared beside him. Apparently had leaped through the open door of the mail car. It was a young man, young, cool robber he was described as. He had a hat pulled way down, he had a bandana across his face, and he had a pistol in his hand. Now the mail clerk had a pistol as well. He was armed. but it was snatched from his side and tossed in the mail bags as the robber pointed at the mail sack and said, "Open, open." Inside that sack was $10,000. It was the weekend receipts of the Belmore National Bank. The mail robber ordered the clerk to exit the car, to move towards the baggage car up ahead and stand outside on that little platform that's between the cars. That's where that man stood until the train pulled into the Merrick station. When the train pulled into the station, the mail clerk jumped off the train onto the platform and screamed for help that he'd been robbed. But no one but he had seen the robber. No one. Not the conductors, not the passengers. The police were called. And when they found that so much money was taken, the federal agents, the FBI was brought in. They brought in bloodhounds to search the Merrick area. Nothing turned up. And so that next morning, the newspapers had the report of all this, and it was seen that this was a pretty clever, athletic robber. People were predicting there was a great future in crime for this person, but that was not to be, because the police were indeed doing every effort they could to track him down. That evening of the robbery, something happened, just a small thing, a small mistake by the robber, and it cost him everything. Two farmers in Astoria. Yep, farmers in Astoria. It sounds strange, but remember, in 1925, we still had a blacksmith right over here on Broadway. So there were farmers in Astoria. They were driving past their field, and they noticed a car had stopped by one of their fields. Thinking not much of it, the next morning, they drove by the same spot and saw there lying on the ground a discarded mail bag. Well, these farmers weren't rubes and hicks. They remembered that car that had been there. And when they turned that mail sack into the post office, they were asked what kind of car that was. And they remembered it was a brown Chrysler Roadster, a new model. And that was the clue that the police investigators needed. Because at that point, they then sent out the All Points Bulletin to be on the lookout for a brown Chrysler Roadster. Word went out to all the police chiefs in the metropolitan area to be on the lookout for a 1925 Chrysler Roadster. Chief Lester Chadwick, that was the Lynbrook police chief at the time, acted quickly. He personally went around to any automobile garage or dealer in the area and found one over by Valley Stream on Merrick Road. They had sold a 1925 Chrysler Roadster to a young man, a James Watt Cadoo. But this man was certainly above suspicion. He was a member of a very important family in Lynbrook, the Cadoo family. His father was, in fact, a lumber merchant. He was a home builder, rather wealthy, owned a lumber yard over by Baisley Avenue. But Chadwick followed this lead and discovered that young James had indeed worked at the Lynbrook post office. His suspicions really became aroused when he discovered that young James had worked on the mail train. And so now suspicion pointed here to 320 Earl Avenue. This is the home where James and his young wife lived. They rented an apartment on the second story. So one night in late January, Chief Chadwick decided to focus his interest on the garage of this house. This is the garage at 320 Earl Avenue that Chief Lester Chadwick had surrounded by postal authorities, FBI agents, Treasury agents. They were all around the block. He sent one of his men around the side. There's an entrance there that they pried open. and inside the Chrysler Roadster. And inside the Chrysler Roadster, in the rumble seat, was a bag with money, $10,000. Well, not quite $10,000, because 400 of it was missing. You see, James Watt Cadoo had thought about his young wife and had given her the $400, not saying where it had come from, and she had it in a spice jar upstairs in the kitchen. He had this to say: "I did it to make my wife comfortable for the rest of her life. We were recently married, and I wanted her to think I'd made good. I knew it would be easy." But the judge wasn't easy. The judge slapped a term of 25 years at hard labor on James Watt Cadoo. 25 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Now, James' wife was quite unhappy with this, as were his parents. They did not even see fit to see him off at the station, when in leg irons and arm chains, they took him off to Atlanta. But if there was some good news about this, it is that when James Watt Cadoo was in that penitentiary in Atlanta, he behaved so well, was a model prisoner, helping out the other inmates, helping out the warden, doing anything he could to show that he had reformed. And in fact, after 12 and a half years, half of his term, he was given a pardon by none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so James Watt Cadoo, after those 12 and a half years, came back to Lynbrook, came back to his family's home, and they welcomed him. His wife did not. She had already sent him the divorce papers a few years before. And so that's the story of James Watt Cadoo, Lynbrook's famous mail robber. And I thank you for joining me in this few minutes of Lynbrook history. For those who are interested in learning more about the Cadoo story, there's a chapter about it in my book, The History of Lynbrook. Stop down to Lynbrook Public Library. There are several copies available down there.